And good evening. I'm Jonathan Higgins.
And I'm Rich Carlson.
And we are doing another great Train Aficionado show. So welcome aboard if you're just joining us this evening. We've got a really cool show tonight. We're talking about the anatomy of the rails.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a really interesting show tonight. We're going to talk about a why, and not the why you're thinking of.
Why?
And a whole bunch of other things that we hear on scanners and such, and we want to know, what does it all mean? So we're going to talk about that. We have a whole bunch of stuff coming up on this show, so definitely stay tuned. If you're joining us for the first time, we talk about everything involving rail fanning, trains, trolleys, transit on this show. Each and every show, we run this 2 times a month, the first Wednesday and the third Wednesday of each month. So definitely tune in, set some reminders on your phone and such. Let's start diving into the slideshow presentation. Let's do that right now. So, of course, it's Season 3 of Train Aficionado Live, Episode 5. So if you're discovering this channel, definitely take a look at our YouTube channel. You can see some of the shows that you've missed. Stay connected with Train Aficionado Live by signing up with our Trackside Bulletin, as our e-newsletter on our website, trainaficionado.com. Also, support our show by shopping our store. We have T-shirts, coffee mugs, hoodies, and all types of cool stuff. So definitely check out our store, and it helps to support the show and the channel, of course. And don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe to our social media as well: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're watching us right now. So here's tonight's rundown. We're going to be talking about the anatomy of the rails. We're going to talk about a low-cost rail fanning mobile antenna for your vehicle. And then Rich is going to take a dive into his photo archive with cab, no problem. Actually, no cabs. So we're going to find out what that's all about in Rich's slideshow presentation. So some interesting stuff tonight. So let's dive into the anatomy of the rails. So, Rich, when this all came about with how wide the rails were going to be, it was all over the place in the beginning.
Yeah, there were 6-foot gauge, 5-foot gauge, 3-foot gauge, and it was all different sizes all over the place. And sometimes they built them to separate gauges on purpose so that they couldn't mix up with trade cars and stuff with the neighboring railroad.
Yeah, I mean, it finally got standardized. So basically, it's 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide in between the rails. But yeah, I mean, it was all over the place. I mean, for the most part, some gauges did stay around, like 2-foot gauge, like up in Maine, where they have a lot of logging and such.
Right.
They ended up doing that narrow gauge, which there is a couple of museums that actually have 2-foot gauge, rail that they run their trains on. Like Edenville Railroad in Carver, Massachusetts has a rail line there. It's 2-foot.
Yeah. Then out west, you got the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge and the Cumberland and Toltec Scenic, and those are 3 feet between the rails.
Yeah, I mean, so there's still some of these smaller gauges that are out there, but basically this was the standard gauge was adopted in spring of 1886.
Yeah.
So finally, it became a standard gauge, for all the main railroads across the country, so they could basically travel like those freight cars you mentioned. They can go from one line to another without any issues.
So what they were doing before they standardized the gauge is if the Mayberry Railroad met the Mount Pilot Railroad and they were different gauges, they would have to either offload the freight from the cars of one railroad to the other, or sometimes what they would do is they would jack up the cars and change out the trucks underneath, and then off they go. It was a royal pain in the patootie. So
yeah, I mean, certainly things have gotten a little bit more simpler now with being able to just be able to have this equipment go from any line. I mean, right now we see a lot of foreign power all over the place lately.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you're seeing, Norfolk Southern locomotives way out by you in Arizona.
Yeah.
I'm seeing, Union Pacific trains out here. I mean, it's all over the place, for everything now.
Over the last 100 and almost 50 years now, railroads have been very cooperative with each other when it comes to standardizing technology, so that a car, a locomotive, a radio from one railroad can work just as well on another. And okay, you go from one railroad to another, change the channel on the radio, press some buttons on the positive train control system, off you go.
So we're looking at this at the rail this evening, and you can see that, if you looked at a railroad track, it looks very much like the image that's on the right. Basically, there is some names for it. Basically, the head, the web, and then the base. So, it's smaller on the top and then a flat base on the bottom. And that's how the rail is kind of constructed. Even the style of the rail has changed over the years as well.
Yeah, and that's the same basic shape, although the rail itself can be of many different sizes. It can be small 100-pound rail, which is 100 pound per yard is the way the weights are done, or it could be all the way up to 136, which is pretty standard on the big busy main lines. And I think there's some rail that's even like around 150 pounds per yard, and basically the parts just get thicker, but that size between the edges of the inside rails has to remain at 4 foot 8.5.
Yeah, and the other thing that we've seen a lot more Class 1 railroads, go from, sections of rail to welded rail, which allows for higher speeds, especially if you've been out at the Northeast Corridor. That's welded rail, and a lot of the Class 1s have adapted that as well. I mean, you can see now some freight trains going 60 plus miles an hour through some certain sections, where, a lot of people think of freight trains are slow and go, but, these really, I mean, you can see on some of the Railfanning cameras that are out there that there is some lines they actually haul the mail, literally.
Oh yeah, they really haul their themselves going pretty quick. And you can see in your picture here, about right in the middle, you can see an actual bolted joint. You can't, right where I'm pointing at.
Yeah.
But
right on the right rail.
On the right rail, about halfway up, you can see that's a bolted joint. And basically what it is you get two big old chunks of metal that fit in on either side of the web of the rail, below the head and above the base, and it's bolted. There's 4 bolts that go between the two joiners and through the rail and join those together, and that's called jointed rail. And that's how things were done for hundreds of years until they came up with the continuous welded rail.
Yeah. Let's continue taking a look. Go ahead.
In the continuous welded rail, you'll see those trains on the rails every once in a while. There'll be a quarter or half mile worth of specialized flat cars with these big multi-level racks on them, and they load these rails coming out of the mills and onto these trains, and there might be 8 levels and 10 across. So you've got.
It's a whole load of rail.
Yeah, so you got 10 or 15 miles worth of track on one train.
And the crazy thing about it is, if you try to pick up a little piece of that rail, let's say if it was cut, it's super heavy. And the other thing too, believe it or not, it's somewhat flexible.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people would think, holy crap, how, like if you've lifted a piece of that rail that's so heavy, how could this be so flexible? How could this be flexible?
Oh yeah, it's when metal gets flexible, the longer it is, the more flexible it seems. And then with jointed rail or stick rail, like Bob mentioned, you'll notice that the length of those sticks, the bolted rails, are typically 39 feet long. And there's a reason for 39 feet, because they would fit in a standard 40-foot gondola car. So you would have enough room on either side, and they cut them to 39-foot length so they would fit in a standard 39-foot car, and then they could just reach in with a crane and put them in and put them out of that car.
It makes perfect sense, to be able to store that in cars that they already currently have.
Yeah. Yep.
So we can't not talk about the anatomy of the rail without talking about the switches. Now, switches, have a whole bunch of components to it. We'll start at the top and work our way down. So you can see at the top, we've got the chart. It shows blue circles on each of the tracks, the outer tracks. There's what a guide rail you can see there, right there. And then also the coolest name of the part of the switch is the frog, which is right in the middle there, that circle. It kind of looks like a frog with its legs, spread out. And then the closure rails, these are the part of the switch that does not move, but the points, that section moves.
Right.
And that basically it has a, you see the place where you can manually throw the switch. Typically that's got a lock on it. And basically it'll go from one side to the other. And then that will move the points, from, in this case, to the main line, to that siding over there. And right now the switch is thrown, and if a train would travel through here, it would stay on the main line.
And you'll notice that at the frog, you'll see that there are little slots, so that when the train wheels go through, they go through that little slot so they don't bounce above it. That's very typical for most situations. There's a newer technology out now where the main line on something like this might be straight railed, but if a crossing track, if there was a crossing track which a lighter used, like maybe a couple trains a day, they would actually go up and over the more heavily used railroad. Obviously, there'd be speed restrictions on something like that, but it allows them to let the mainline trains go through without slowing down, without having any disruption at all. And then the crossing traffic, which is a lot less trained, would have a kind of a bump as they go up and over. It's a new technology that they're using in some railroads. I've seen it occasionally here and there, but it's still relatively unusual.
The thing with railroad switches, we of course have the manual switch, which you can see here. And then you see, probably while you're out rail fanning, you don't see this. You see, it looks like a motor box there, because it's a remote switch. So which is controlled by a dispatcher. And a lot of the Class 1 railroads, their main lines are all thrown remotely. And then you'll see secondary tracks where, they do have these hand throws, but most of the main lines, they're controlling these switches, hundreds or even thousands of miles away, which is crazy, to think of it. Somebody's controlling the switch. I remember listening to the Northeast Corridor, and there was issues with the switch, and of course there was snow on the ground. they sent the signal maintainer out there, the track maintainer out there, to be able to look at what was going on. So the dispatcher said, I can't throw the switch. Can you go out there and look? So, they try to clear some of the debris out of there. And then the dispatcher says, he said, all right, go ahead and try the switch. And the dispatcher confirms over the radio, are your hands and everything clear of the switch?
Yeah.
Because if that goes, it's going to hurt.
Yes, it is.
The dispatcher oftentimes, when they gave them the go ahead, they would often check, is everything clear before I do this?
Yep. And another thing you'll notice if you're up in the northern climes where snow and ice are an issue, a lot of switches, the facilities will have heaters built into the roadbed underneath the switches, and sometimes they're gas fed, sometimes it's oil, and it actually has a heater fire going in there to keep the snow and ice from accumulating on the rails at that location. And having been on the police department, we would get calls all the time. The railroad tracks are on fire. No, they're just keeping the snow from accumulating on the track.
Yeah, because that raises havoc when they're not able to throw switches.
Yeah.
That a lot of times it can be a propane fed switch heater that's underneath there.
Yeah.
There's also mentioning about spring switches as well.
Yeah. So a spring switch is a switch which you can manually or remotely turn, but then when the train is going in the opposite direction, it will automatically flip over to the normal position. It's on a spring. So when a train is going through it, the movement of the train will force the switch into the proper position. And when the trains come in the opposite direction, it can force it back to the other position.
It's so interesting, the anatomy of switches. This is something, that you can, that we see all the time. It's literally how the railroad directs traffic, pretty much.
Yeah. And there are different ways of controlling the switch. There are even locations where you can remotely control a switch with like the DTMF pad, the touch tone pad on a railroad radio. So a train can approach a switch and they can see that it's not lined the right way. They can put in a code on their radio, and that will actually automatically turn the switch. And then you notice the green flag, if you will, on the switch stand. Yeah. That indicates that it's going straight ahead. If that were red or orange, it would indicate that you're going to veer off.
Yeah. All types of cool things, along the rails that you can, that are indications of things. It's super neat. I've been out rail fanning and hearing those remote switches being thrown.
Yeah.
And I knew there was a section along the main line, the Charlotte division, of Norfolk Southern, and I knew something would be coming out of the Linwood yard when I would hear that switch start to move, and I know, it's positioned to come out of something's either going in or coming out of the yard.
Yeah, and Wayne brings up a very good point. The straight position is considered what they call the normal position, and then if it's set for the siding, that's called the reverse position. So that's a very good point, Wayne. You'll hear that on the scanner. If the switch is in the normal position, that means it's for straight ahead.
All right, let's continue on with our slideshow presentation here. So a Y, and it's even spelled differently. Y, the Y is spelled W-Y-E.
Why is that?
Because it's a little different than, a regular, the YMCA or, or why are you doing that, type of thing. It's a different spelling for sure. And the other thing too, is it kind of, the Y looks just like a Y pretty much, as you can see here. These can be put at a junction point where one railroad meets another, as you can see here in the, both on the map and on the diagram. this is a great way for, this is the Charlotte district, as you can see here on the map. That's going basically from the top to the bottom of the image. And so trains can continue going past the Y and continuing traveling south or north. And then if they wanted to get on what this is the S line, they can access the S line from either direction. It's kind of like a on ramp, per se, and it's also acts as an on and off ramp, to the other line as well. The other cool thing about a Y, it gives you the ability to basically turn a whole train around. As you can see here in the diagram, the number 1, so the train goes beyond the Y, and then number 2 backs up on the top leg of the Y, and then it goes forward again on the other leg, number 3, and the whole train is in the opposite direction at this point. Now, the great thing about this is I've seen this a couple of times, railfanning in North Carolina. A crew may not want to run a locomotive long hood.
Right.
So what they'll do is, I've heard it a couple of times, they request to run down the line to use the Y. I don't know what was going on one of the times. The dispatcher asking, what are you doing? I don't want to run this long hood, so I want to use the Y. Okay. All right, let me throw the switches so you can so you can be able to not do that. I mean, the great thing about it is just amazing.
Bob Fredericks writes that the Durango Silverton has one at Silverton. Been on that. In fact, I was there last time a couple years ago, and you're exactly right. When the steam train gets, and that's a narrow gauge we were talking about earlier, by the way, too. When they get to Silverton, they let all the passengers off. They can go to the gift shops and get some lunch and stuff in Silverton, and then the crew takes the train and they back it up the Y, and then they pull it forward again, and then they back it up to the depot in town so that the train is now pointed in the other direction. So, that's a great use for a Y.
Yeah, it totally is. I mean, just being able to, you're thinking of that's like a point A to point B route. So, rather than running 2 locomotives on each end or a control cab on one end and a locomotive on the other, they're able to flip the whole train around. And it's, nobody really, for the most part, people that go on that train magically come out of there and the train's in the other direction.
Yeah.
And they don't realize the magic of it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's some work behind it. And, a turntable is great for a locomotive, because it's got limited length and you can turn a locomotive, but you're not going to be able to turn an entire train on a turntable. And sometimes it's just not practical to build a turntable, and they're expensive. And a Y may already exist. You may have a junction, and there's already going to be a connecting track. And if you want to make a junction into a Y, you just have to add one more track and you're done. So, yeah, like Steve said, they're very cheap to do. All you need is a little bit of land, a little bit of track.
Yeah, I've seen this, quite a bit. And we've actually seen on some of these, Rich, where we've been kind of looking for abandoned railroad tracks and such. Sometimes one of the legs of the Y becomes abandoned because they're not using it in that sense. And we've seen several of those. I know I have through open railway maps.
Yep. Matthew, Arizona, out near Wickenburg, not too far from me. There used to be a Y at the junction between the Arizona, California, and the BNSF. And since they don't use that leg of the Y anymore, they abandoned the track. And now you can go this way and back, but you can't go the other way.
Yeah, there's one, and I just wrote a blog entry up in Hamilton, Ohio, and there used to be a full Y there, and they abandoned one of the legs of the Y, which is interesting. So they're not able to do this maneuver. Of course, you're limiting, like you said, direction of traffic. Maybe traffic's able to head on to that other line heading eastbound, but it's hard for trains going the other way to be able to get on. There's not a on and off ramp, as we call it here, like we see with a full Y.
If you go back to the slide with the switch on it,
Yep.
We have a question from Randy to explain the derail at the Fort Madison Swing Bridge. It works very much like a switch. So if you watch the video cam, the rail cam at Fort Madison, there is a derail. Basically, what it is, it's very similar to a switch, except there's no siding there. And what that switch does is it actually disconnects the main line so that unless that train has got permission to approach the bridge, it's going to derail the train before it goes to the bridge. It's relatively common before you get to a bridge. So, yeah, and it works just like a switch does, except that there's just not another track there.
Yeah, the Cape Cod Railroad Bridge, they recently installed a derail on both sides. I remember, they recently did that. And it's exactly like what you said, Rich. I mean, especially with the Cape Cod Railroad Bridge, that's one of those that goes up.
Yeah.
If the train continues going, there's going to be a huge mess. So
splash.
Yeah, so this way it derails the train, and hopefully
Fort Madison is a big a turntable bridge, a rotating bridge, and same thing. The train would end up in the drink. So if it's going to,
and also damaging the bridge as well.
Yeah, exactly. So they figure, where is a better place to derail the train if you absolutely got to derail the train, and that's before it hits the bridge.
Yeah, I mean, these are it's so neat, and then turntables are becoming a thing of the past. So like Steven is written, Queensgate in Ohio has got a turntable. Middletown has a Y.
Yeah.
And then, Toledo uses the Y at Stanley to spin the locomotives at, was it Walbridge?
Yeah.
And they got rid of the turntable, in various yards. And the craziest thing, Rich, when we typically do our hunting through the satellite, looking at a yard, you can a lot of times see where the turntable used to be.
Yeah. Well, the turntables became really popular. Well, they were a big thing in the steam locomotive days, because steam locomotives were put away into an engine house at night or when between trains, because they were much more maintenance intensive. So most of the maintenance was done inside the locomotive or the roundhouse, because they were kind of circular. So there would be a track leading into the turntable, and the turntable would go around, and then there would be all these different tracks. There could be 2 or 3 or 25 tracks into stalls of the roundhouse. So you'd pull the locomotive onto the turntable, you would turn it around, and then back the locomotive into the proper stall. And there could be, 20 or 25 stall roundhouses. Most of them are smaller than that, 4 or 5 or maybe up to 10, but some of them are really big. And and then you back the locomotive in or pull it in, whichever way. And then with the steam locomotives, they weren't bi-directional like diesels have been. So they had to be facing the right way. So you'd use that turntable not only to put it away for the night, but to take it out in the morning and make sure it's pointing the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, the coolest operation that I've seen was the North Carolina Transportation Museum. They have their turntable, and it's a pretty large roundhouse.
Yeah.
And 611 barely fits in there in the roundhouse, because of its length. Sometimes usually, some of it will hang out of the roundhouse a little bit just because they can't pull it all the way through. But yeah, I mean, it's super cool to be able to see those in action. And there's some of those turntables that are motorized, and some of them, believe it or not, a guy or two can do exactly what Rich is showing, move this huge locomotive on the turntable without too much trouble.
Well, they're all based on a pivot, so you got this big, huge piece of steel with this 100-ton locomotive on it, and it's basically on a pivot point, and it's actually has a rail around the outside part of the pit that the turntable sits in. And once you get it going, did you say that again? All right, Siri, you can shut up. Once you get it going, you can actually move that thing pretty well.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's the coolest thing about it. I mean, everybody's mentioning, the roundhouses and turntables. I mean, there's such cool
Sacramento Rail Mission. Yeah, I was just there a couple of years ago, and they do have that turntable there. It's really cool to watch.
All right, let's continue on. So these are things that we typically hear on the scanner. We'll hear about a passing siding. And a lot of times when we look at the timetables, it'll actually say how long that siding is, because that's key now. With a lot of these trains, some of them may not fit on that siding if it's X amount of feet long.
Yep. Yeah, you can't fit a 5-mile long train on a 4-mile long siding.
Yes, that's definitely key. And the other thing a siding is basically used for is for passing. So let's say if you have a passenger train that's, of course, moving a lot faster than a freight, you may want to side the freight so the passenger train can pass them, essentially. Or the other thing too, you may have a single line track and you have oncoming traffic. Yeah. So you've got one coming east and one going west. Somebody's going to have to pull off.
Yeah.
Because you both can't be on the single line track together.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so you always know a passing siding because there's a way in and a way out. Yeah. And then a set off siding only has one switch. And you'll find set off sidings all over the place. They might be there just so they can set off a bad car, or it might have been used at one point to deliver freight to a customer along the side. But, passing sidings, and some of the passing sidings can be several miles long. Or what they'll do is they'll take a railroad that used to be double track, and in order to save money on maintenance and property taxes, they will convert it to a single track main line with centralized traffic control, and they'll have these ungodly long passing sidings every X amount of miles. The Illinois Central main line through Illinois used to be double track from Chicago to Cairo, and when they decided to make it a single track with CTC, they just cut one of the tracks and made them into a whole bunch of different sidings, but all along the way.
Yeah, that's for sure. And it's such a cool thing to be able to hear that communication over the radio, that, I'm going to have to side you, or you're going to tie down at such and such siding.
Yeah.
The other cool thing is the diamond junctions. And boy, do you know when you're rail fanning by a diamond junction, because you hear the kunk, 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 every wheel hitting the and then there is what we have in the drawing. There is a single diamond, but there's some railroads that are a double diamond. Yeah. And there's, so you'll have two main lines going over a single track, or and it's a cool thing because this is where the two railroads meet. And a lot of times there will be a track to be able to join one railroad to another, which kind of almost looks like a Y type of thing.
Yeah.
As well. But yeah, I mean, there's
there's a Rochelle, Illinois.
Yeah.
A million times. And you can watch it on the cam. And there's two main lines crossing at a diamond there, and just like you said, a connecting track between the two of them.
And for example, another place where there's a diamond is in Palmer, Massachusetts, by the train station there, which is the Steaming Tender Restaurant. Mm-hmm. Marion, Ohio. There's a couple of diamonds there. I'm just trying to think of some of the ones that are there. But yeah, I mean, some of these are done, when the two rail lines meet at grade level. And then, of course, you may have certain parts of the country where they've elevated one track, so it's an over-under type of thing.
Yeah. Is it Grand Island, Nebraska? I think it was Grand Island, Nebraska. The BN and the Union Pacific had a diamond there, and it really slowed up traffic because there were two really busy main lines. So they built the bridge, and the one railroad goes over, and the other railroad goes under, and they don't have to stop for each other anymore.
And look, more diamonds in Ohio.
Yeah,
I mean, there's
a lot of them have cameras now. If you go to Railstream or what's the other one?
Virtual Railfan.
Virtual Railfan. A lot of the cameras are at diamonds because you get twice the traffic. You get traffic on both lines.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly keeps it entertaining as well.
Yeah.
To be able to see see the activity there. I mean, the one at the Steaming Tender restaurant, you actually have 3 railroad lines. You have the New England Central Railroad, the Mass Central Railroad, and CSX.
Yeah,
running on the main line there, and then occasionally you'll see Amtrak rolling through there. But yeah, I mean, it's quite entertaining to be able to see that. And then there's, the funny thing is, there'll be a slow moving freight blocking the main line for CSX, and you'll be like, hopefully nothing's coming because, it's it's just, slow moving.
Yeah. When you start talking about the next one, we can then mention Wayne's one of Wayne's comments here. So let's do the crossover first, and then we can do that one. Yeah.
Yeah, so the crossover is really neat. I mean, this allows you to be able to change, essentially, going from track 1 to track 2. So let's say when I was in North Carolina, maintenance all the time, and they would basically shut down one of the tracks, and then they would use the crossover to be able to get the train to go from track 1 to track 2. And then eventually, if it was a passenger train and it was obligated to a certain platform, it would return back to the previous track. But for the great thing of it, it's kind of a way to be able to get that train from one track to another. It works out great. Like the Northeast Corridor has them as well. Typically, they would use this for the Acela that's trying to pass a slower moving passenger train. Mm-hmm. So they'll use one of these crossovers. So the Acela is running on track 1. There's a passenger train ahead that's running at a slower speed on track 1. They use the crossover, and then it'll go on to track 2 and just right past it. So it's kind of like the passing lane on the highway.
Yeah.
In that case.
And sometimes they'll have these crossovers where the crossing tracks will actually cross each other instead of being separate like the diagram. And those get even more maintenance intensive. That's why something like what you have shown here is preferable to the railroad because there's a lot less maintenance on them. But I've seen some of them where the crossovers cross each other. So talking about Wayne's terminology called a pocket. So basically what you would do is oops, sorry about that. That was my fault. Let me turn off the picture so we can see the diagram. If you consider that those crossovers are far enough apart, they can cross a train onto one track and then have let's say one track is mostly eastbound, one's mostly westbound. You can put a slower eastbound track onto the westbound main and then run the faster train that's coming up from behind it, past it, and then the other train will switch back to its regular track after the fact. So you could, you might have 2 crossovers that are 20 miles apart, and then they'll switch the slow train off, whiz the fast train past it, and then they'll switch the slow train back to its main line again.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too is if there's a station there as well. There could be a station there, and you have the passenger train stopping there, and that passenger train is at the station. You can have that faster train get on the other track, zoom right past it, and be done. I mean, the Northeast Corridor, they use these crossovers all the time, and then we see it used at Altoona, like with the various tracks that are there as well. I mean, the there's one of these crossover sections by what was it, Tower MG, which is now, the tower is gone. They tore it down. But if you look where the tower was on satellite, you would see a whole bunch of this, with the 3 tracks with the crossovers.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what a Conley joint is. Do you?
I'm not familiar with that. I mean, we could certainly look that up and see what that's
maybe
all
about. Maybe one of our watchers will know what it is. Unfortunately, I've not heard that term, so maybe one of our watchers will know about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We'll come back to this. Hopefully, we'll get somebody that'll pipe in, or we'll see if we can try to dive into this a little bit more. But yeah,
Wayne, what's a Conley joint?
And I know, I'm just trying to think. Steven's out there, so hopefully he'll be able to chime in, as well. Let's see.
An expansion joint? Okay, maybe.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, like I said, I've never heard the term, but I'm sure somebody will know. Oh, they're used on lift bridges. Oh, is that split rail derail, Bob?
Yeah, it could be. Okay. I don't know.
Oh, we stumped Steve. We stumped Wayne too.
Oh my word. Yeah. So, the funny thing about it is, there's different terms for different railroads for different things. Like they may call something XYZ and another calls it ABC, but it's technically the same thing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I imagine it's probably some sort of an expansion joint. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is. I guess it's trying to stump us with this one. I don't know what. And it's probably named after a person, this joint or whatever it is. I'm sure.
Probably the guy who designed it.
Yeah. So that was a little bit of our anatomy of the railroads. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a low-cost railfanning mobile antenna. Now, Rich and we've used this antenna for wideband communications.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that this antenna works really well on the VHF for monitoring the railroads. It's not that expensive. It's $19.95. You can purchase it from a Scanner Master. It's 17 inches tall. It's got 12 feet of coax cable. It comes with a BNC connector, which fits most scanners, and then it also has an SMA version in case you have one of those. It's a super strong mini magnet which will hold on to your car even at high speeds. Easy on and off for traveling. If you're using a rental car for a week or a weekend, you can bring this antenna. It's great even for placing outdoors to improve reception at the home or office.
Yep.
But this antenna is great. The thin coax cable allows you to be able to put this on the outside of your vehicle with ease. And also, it's great for putting it out a window of your home. If you got an air conditioner unit outside your window, it works great. I find that this antenna works pretty well on the railroads. You could get that tall whip, but a lot of times, that could be too tall. You'll be hitting, drive-throughs and such, depending on what type of vehicle you have.
Even though it's not really intended to be a transmit antenna, I have used it as a dual band antenna on my car in between, trying to get my, my antennas installed. So it will work pretty well, and it's a great antenna for the price. You can't beat it.
That's for sure. All right, so Rich, let's take a look at your slideshow. So. Yeah. We're looking at locomotives that don't have cabs.
Yep. No cab, no problem. So not all locomotives have a cab. And of course, we all know what a cab is. That's where the engineer sits and controls the train. He doesn't have a steering wheel. He's got a throttle. He can make it go this way. He can make it go that way, but he can't turn it, obviously.
Well, you can turn it when you derail it.
Oh, yeah, but not
intentionally.
So what a cabless unit is, and there's a couple different reasons why you might have a okay, there you go. The expansion joint named after the guy who developed it.
Yep, there we go.
Thanks, Steve. So a cab unit, sometimes they're called boosters. They're B units, slugs, brake trailers. Basically, they are either a locomotive or a former locomotive that has a purpose other than actually controlling the train. So this is what we would call a booster unit or a B unit. It's basically a GP30 locomotive, but it doesn't have a cab. So it cannot control the train from this locomotive. It can only work with another locomotive. I wish I would have found this picture before last week's show because we could see what a GP30 without a cab looks like. This one was on its way to the scrap line. That's why all the doors are open and it looks like it's about ready to fall apart. That was in Council Bluffs, Iowa, back in the early 80s.
Oops.
And then there's a B unit is basically a fully equipped locomotive. It just doesn't have the control cab. They'll typically have a little control stand inside one of the doors where a hostler can actually run it around the yard and move it to where it has to go. I've actually seen hostlers using a B unit with the hostler controls to switch cars in a yard. And they're not supposed to do it, but it's been done. Again, they are basically intended to be used with another locomotive. This is what's called a TR2B or a transfer unit, to B, and it's basically a switcher without a control cab. EMD sold these as 1, 2, or 3 unit sets. 1 unit set would have just a regular switcher. A 2 unit set would have a regular switcher and a cabless, and then they have a 3 unit set with a switcher with a cab, and then 2 cabless units, and they called that a herd because they had, that was basically following. So they were kind of unusual, but they were around. And then they've got the thing called booster units or slugs. And basically what a slug is, it's usually a former locomotive that has had the diesel engine either removed or disabled, and then they put concrete, gravel, sand in there to weight it down, and that assists in the tractive effort. But they leave the traction motors on, connected to the wheels, and they plug extension cords between the booster unit, the slug, and a mother unit, and it draws electricity from the mother unit and powers the traction motors on the booster, and it allows them to get more axles that are powered, because at low speeds the mother unit usually has horsepower to spare and power to spare, but more motors means more tractive effort, and you can get more torque out of it and pull a lot more with that. It won't go very fast, but in a yard, speed is not an issue. Sometimes they're built from the factory like that. There are occasionally, I think a couple of companies have made them. And then most of the time, though, they are former locomotives. And this one's BU41. It's a former RS3 that the Northwestern converted to a slug. CSX uses them. Yeah, absolutely. CSX even has road slugs that they use on local trains. And CSX has got kind of a unique situation. They have some slugs that actually, they kept the cab in place, and they can operate the train from the cab of the slug. And there's just no diesel engine in there. So obviously they have to have a regular diesel in there, but they can operate it from either the diesel or from the slug.
It comes in handy when you're trying to go, like you're not having to use the Y. Basically, if you have both locomotives to rear end, you basically, when you go north, you're on one end, and then when you go back south, you just run it from the slug, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And they use it for local traffic. And, these local trains might have 50 or 100 cars, and they might go 50 or 100 miles, but they're not the big, long, fast road freight. And then you go back to the B units. So the Conrail 3811 there is was originally a Pennsylvania Railroad, but that was bought like that from the factory. It's basically a complete locomotive with no cab.
Yeah,
and that one,
low profile too.
Yeah, it's basically a power brick. And that was very common when diesel locomotives first came into prominence right after World War II, especially with the F units. You would have when you bought an F unit locomotive, you bought a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 unit set, and that was considered a locomotive. And then there's just power bricks in there. So you had the A unit with the cab, and then you might have 1 or 2 or 3 B units with no cab, and then another A unit on the other end. So it was bidirectional. 1118 on the lower picture is a former Alco RSD-12, and it was converted to a slug either by Conrail or more likely Pennsylvania Railway. They called them motor trailers, or the model MT6. It's probably the 6th design. And they used them at Selkirk Yard and a couple of the other yards out east. And again, they draw power from the mother unit and power the traction motors on the slug. They used them up in Canada. BC Rail had both cabless locomotives like the 686 on the top picture. It was bought that way from Montreal Locomotive Works, which is the Canadian version of Alco. And other railroads, if they wrecked a locomotive, or they had some big problems with it, they just slice the cab off and make it into a B unit. And they also had slugs on the BC Rail. The S405 was slug. 405 was an old LS&I RS3 locomotive. They cut the top off, removed the cab, filled it with concrete, and connected extension cords to the locomotive.
Wow.
The BN, relatively unusual for the time, in the late 70s and early 80s. By then, B units were pretty much out of fashion. They actually went out and bought a boatload. They bought 120 B30-7As. And most railroads had gotten away from it, but they went and bought them, 2 different orders, and you can see they look a little differently. The 4007 on the lower picture has got pretty much a straight through roof line. And then if you take a look at the one on the top, the 4113, and it has a dynamic brake. The dynamic brakes has a extended housing for the fans for the dynamics. So again, a fully equipped locomotive, just no control cap. The Santa Fe was the last purchaser of cabless locomotives, and they were the GP60 locomotive, and they're still running on the BNSF now. These are long gone, but the GP60B units, which unfortunately I didn't have a picture handy, are still running on the Santa Fe. You see them in Galesburg. They work out of the yard there in Galesburg. And then if you take a look at the top picture, that is an E7B, and that's what the B units of locomotives looked like after World War II. They looked just like the regular E unit and F units, except they were, obviously had no cab on them. And again, when you bought the locomotive, you bought it as a set. 1 cab and a couple B units, or 2 cabs and a couple B units, or 2 cabs and a B unit, whatever you told the builder you wanted. And that was considered a single locomotive. And a lot of times they would have all the units would share the same number. So you could have, locomotive 123A, 123B, 123C, and 123D, and depending on the railroad, typically it was A was always a cab unit and C was always a cab unit, because most of the time they would buy them in 3-unit sets. But if they bought a 4-unit set, A and C were always cab units, so the B units would be the B and the D. So 123B and 123D would be the B units. On the Rock Island also had their own slugs. So that one was a former U-33B, and it rests with one of its mate. And when I used the word mate, I meant it as a friend. But unfortunately, I didn't have a picture of it. But the Seaboard Coastline bought new slugs from General Electric. Basically, it looked like the bottom half of a standard General Electric locomotive, but again, no diesel engine, no cab. And it was mated with a mother unit, and it even had a fuel tank. It could be used as a fuel tender. And those were actually called mates. And it was like motive assisted tractive, motor to assist tractive effort or something like that is what mate stood for on that. As far as I know, Seaboard Coastline was the only one who actually bought those, and they lasted into the CSX days.
Wow.
And that's it, my friend.
Well, I mean, that's certainly awesome to be able to see all that, and definitely getting a lot of conversation in the chat here as well, which is great. So definitely, if you like what you see, stay connected with Train Aficionado through our website. You can sign up for our newsletter, the Trackside Bulletin, on our website, trainaficionado.com. You can also support our show by shopping our store. We have T-shirts, coffee mugs, hoodies, and so much more there. And then we also have our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. Make sure you follow, like, and subscribe to our social media as well. I'm posting often on all of our social media channels, and I'm trying to blog each and every week. I included a post this week about the Smiley antenna that I was able to try out. By one of our viewers mentioned it. It's a really good antenna. I would recommend that. You can look at the blog entry for that. I also did a blog entry recently about Hamilton, Ohio, and all of its railroads there. And I'm just trying to think of what the Cincinnati terminal did a blog entry about that as well. So a lot of great stuff coming on there. I'm trying to blog each and every week, so definitely check the website, trainaficionado.com, often. Coming up next week for the scanner guys, we're going to talk of the history of police scanner crystals and what do we do with them now. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to go over what some of the top scanners were in the crystal days, and then kind of go over the process of what it was all about, those of you that didn't live through the crystal era of scanning. And that'll be Wednesday, March the 9th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific. If you're watching us on a tablet, smartphone, or on your computer, you can also watch us on TV as well. You can download on the Roku or the Apple TV, the YouTube app, and you can watch us on the big screen. So definitely some cool stuff there. So our next Train Aficionado live show will be the following Wednesday, March the 16th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific. So make sure you set a reminder to join us for that show as well. So some really good stuff tonight. I mean, we talked about some of the anatomy of the tracks, a mobile antenna that's not that expensive, and of course, these B units and slugs. I mean, things that that are not always talked about with railfanning. That's for sure.
Yeah, and we learned something. I didn't know what a colony joint was, and now I do.
Yeah, I mean, that's super neat. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing with those B units. They looked really cool with the F and E units.
Yeah.
I mean, because it had that design, that streamlined.
Yeah.
Because I think of those when when you're buying, some model trains in that era, they will sell B units, and they will be, some of the manufacturers of the model trains will actually have the B unit, so it's powered. So technically it's providing power to the A unit as well.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I mean, and
cool.
That's how they were built back then, and the typical locomotive of the time was around 1,500 horsepower, and that wasn't nearly enough to power the train. So you'd put, 2 or 3 or 4 of these things together to make one locomotive. And part of the reason why they considered it one locomotive was union rules, because each locomotive had to have an engineer and a fireman, and if they were considered separate locomotives, they would have to have staff on each of the units. So if they called it one locomotive, even though there were separate parts, you could do it with one crew.
Wow. But yeah, I mean, this is, certainly we're looking for additional topics of discussion for this particular show. So if you've got topics you'd like us to cover, definitely email us through the Train Aficionado website. We're also looking for guests for this show as well. So if you know people that are in the railroad industry or part of museums and such, we would love to have you on to the show, to discuss, what's going on in the museum or with your club. Also, the other thing too is if you've got an interesting story, we would love to hear about it, involving the rails. But yeah, definitely, this is great to have everybody here tonight, joining us. I think we've answered a vast majority of the questions through the show, I believe.
Yeah, I think the only one that I get is a while back at about 20 after, a question came up: what does a high rail vehicle's lift frog mean? I imagine that's something that he saw on a sign along the railroads, along the railroad right away, and I would imagine it's probably just a reminder that there might be a lift frog, and that's when I was talking before about the diamonds, where one railroad actually cross and kind of go over the other one, where the main line would go straight through. So that might be a reminder that if a high rail vehicle is coming, that there is a lift frog coming up, which means he'll be going up and over, so he doesn't hit that at 40 miles an hour and derail his high rail truck.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, those high rail trucks, those wheels are a lot smaller than the actual on the train. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm betting that's what that means.
Yeah, I'm sure it doesn't feel that great hitting that. It's like hitting a speed bump.
Oh yeah, it's, if you've ever hit a speed bump, at 40 miles an hour. Yeah. Yep, there you go. Lift frog lifts the wheels by the flange and reduces the banging wear on the frog. So, yep. Good call on that one.
I think that's going to wrap it up for us this evening.
I think we're good.
Well, I thank you so much for joining us. As this channel grows, we hope that you tell your friends and family that are interested into rail fanning and trains and transit and trolleys to definitely join us for this broadcast. Definitely like the page through our social media. Also, we don't have a sponsor to this show whatsoever. So you can always support the channel by, of course, shopping our store. We have all types of merchandise there at trainaficionado.com. And then, of course, the stay in the know. We don't send email blasts all the time, but when we do, we will include you on it if you sign up for the Trackside Bulletin. It's an e-newsletter that we send out occasionally. And then make sure you follow, like, and subscribe to our social media as well: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram at Train Aficionado. Definitely send your suggestions via email. You can email Train Aficionado. Our email address is real easy: trainaficionado@gmail.com. That's trainaficionado@gmail.com. We would love to see your your suggestions for upcoming shows, or even some upcoming guests as well. So we appreciate everyone joining us. So we hope you had a lot of fun. I learned a lot about B units and slugs and so on. So I thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jonathan Higgins.
I'm Rich Carlson.
Have a great night and happy rail fanning out there.